My name is Emily, and I met Chris 12 years ago at a business networking event. He was a senior manager at a company I was just starting to collaborate with. At the time, I was running a successful chain of beauty salons, and Chris was well established in his field, intelligent and engaging. He had that natural charisma that made people gravitate toward him. But what really drew me to him wasn't just his accomplishments. It was the way he spoke about his daughter, Sarah. He would often light up when he mentioned her, telling me stories about her life, how proud he was of her academic achievements, and how she was blossoming into such a kind, capable young woman. I could see the love in his eyes, the kind of love I'd always dreamed of having in my own family. I've never been able to have children of my own, something I had come to terms with over the years. But when I met Chris and heard about Sarah, I felt like maybe this was the second chance I'd always wanted to have a family. 6 months after we met, Chris and I got married, and Sarah moved in with us. The financial difference between Chris and me was noticeable. He earned far less than I did, and I often took care of most of our financial obligations. But that didn't bother me. I'd never believed that love had anything to do with money. I was just happy to have found someone I could share my life with, and someone who already had a child I could love as my own. When Sarah turned 16, I bought her a car. It was reliable, safe, and a step into independence. I was so proud of her when I handed her the keys. Her face lit up as she hugged me, tears of gratitude in her eyes. "Thank you, Emily. You're the best." I was overjoyed to see her so happy, and for a moment, I felt like the mother I'd always hoped to be. 2 years later, as Sarah prepared to leave for college, I didn't hesitate to offer to pay for her education. It wasn't Ivy League, but it was a good school, one where Sarah could thrive and build her future. She was so grateful, her excitement contagious as she talked about her new life. In those early years, things were perfect. Chris and I were happy. Sarah seemed to appreciate everything I did for her, and our house felt like a home filled with love and laughter. Those first few years after I became part of Sarah's life felt like a dream. She stayed with us through college, saving money while starting her career. She would come to me with questions, seek advice, and we would sit together late into the night planning her future. The relationship we built was strong, or at least I thought it was. But everything changed when Sarah met Michael. I remember the evening she came home practically glowing with excitement. She had been dating Michael for 2 years, and now they were engaged. She rushed into the house, her hand raised to show off the sparkling diamond on her finger. "Dad! Emily! He proposed!" she shouted, excitement in every syllable. I had always liked Michael. He was a good guy, well-mannered, and kind to Sarah. I was thrilled for them, but something shifted that night. The excitement didn't last long before the reality of wedding planning set in. They started talking about a grand wedding, something extravagant. Sarah wanted a venue with crystal chandeliers, marble floors, and an impressive menu. When she told me it would cost around $150,000, I didn't hesitate. "I'll cover it," I said. It wasn't even a question. I set up an account for them to manage all wedding-related expenses, and I transferred the money. I was happy to do it for Sarah, happy to see her so excited. The planning was supposed to be a joyous time, and at first, it was. Sarah included me in everything, asking my opinion on dresses, flowers, and even the color scheme. I was in heaven, helping her choose the perfect details for her big day. But gradually, I began to feel like I was being pushed out. At first, it was subtle. Instead of spending hours together planning, Sarah would rush through dinner and disappear into her room, texting or talking to Michael. It didn't seem like the Sarah I had gotten to know so well. When I asked her how the planning was going, she would brush me off with vague responses. "It's fine, don't worry. Everything's under control." I tried to tell myself it was normal. Weddings are stressful, I thought. Maybe she just needed space. But my gut told me something was wrong. I discussed it with Chris, hoping he could reassure me, but he only said, "She's probably just busy with everything. Don't worry." Yet, the more I thought about it, the more I felt like this was more than just wedding stress. Something wasn't right. Then came the conversation that really changed everything. I casually asked Sarah about the guest list. "Have you figured out how many people you're inviting?" I asked one morning over coffee. Her response was quick but distant. "Yeah, we're keeping it small, about 50 people. I asked her about my family, my parents and my sister. They had always supported her, celebrated her achievements. They'd been there for her for years, but Sarah's face hardened. We're only inviting close relatives and friends, she said, her voice cold. I don't want anyone who's not really family. My heart sank. After everything I had done for her, everything I had sacrificed, my family was suddenly not really family in her eyes. I tried to reason with her. My family has known you since you were 13. They've been there for you, through birthdays, graduations, and I'm paying for the wedding. I was starting to feel hurt, but I kept my voice steady. Surely we can make an exception for 3 people who care about you. Her response was sharp. Fine, she snapped. I'll send invitations to your mom and sister. Happy now? She grabbed her phone and stormed out of the kitchen, leaving me standing there stunned. How had everything come to this? I had tried to be there for her, to help her create the wedding of her dreams, and now I was being dismissed like this. Later that evening, when Chris and I spoke, I told him what had happened. He seemed more concerned about Sarah's feelings than the reality of the situation. Maybe you could have been gentler with her, he suggested. She's under a lot of stress, but I wasn't having it. I had done everything I could for Sarah, and this was how she was repaying me. The unease in our house grew as the wedding day approached, but I couldn't shake the feeling that Sarah was pulling away from me. Something was about to break, and I wasn't sure what it would be. It was just days after the guest list argument when I learned Sarah had invited her mother, Linda. The name alone made my blood run cold. Linda had been out of the picture for years. Sarah hadn't spoken about her much, and I had always assumed the worst. The basics I knew were that she had a drinking problem and had essentially abandoned Sarah after their divorce. For over a decade, Linda's absence had never felt like a loss to me or to Sarah. And then, out of nowhere, Sarah invited her to the wedding. Without even discussing it with me first, I was blindsided. I felt like I was losing control of everything I had worked for, everything I had built. Sarah's words still echoed in my mind. I'm inviting my mom. She wants to be part of the wedding planning. The anger hit me like a tidal wave. This was my house, my wedding, my family now. Linda had not been part of Sarah's life for years, and she sure as hell hadn't been there through all the milestones, high school graduations, her college years, and even her first car that I had gifted her. And yet, Sarah was suddenly rolling out the red carpet for the woman who hadn't cared enough to even send a birthday card. I sat in the living room fuming. Chris had noticed, of course. He'd been quieter than usual. Every word he said seemed to rub salt in the wound. You need to let Sarah do this, Maddie. She's under a lot of pressure. But no, this wasn't about pressure. It was about respect, about the years I had sacrificed for this family, the way I had supported Sarah in every possible way. And now it felt like I wasn't even part of the equation. When Linda finally showed up for dinner that weekend, it was just as I feared. I spent hours preparing an extravagant meal, herb-crusted rack of lamb, roasted vegetables, homemade bread, and yet, she found a way to critique everything. The lamb would taste better with rosemary and garlic, she said. You've overcooked the vegetables, Maddie. The woman didn't even have the decency to pretend she was grateful. I sat there, my jaw clenched, as she picked apart my cooking, my house, everything I had worked for. And Chris? He just sat there, looking at his plate, not offering a word. His silence only made it worse. It was as if he was waiting for me to bow down and apologize to Linda. But I wasn't going to. Not this time. Not after everything I had done for this family, and especially not after all the years Linda had abandoned Sarah. It was when Linda started talking about the wedding venue that I snapped. She called the place I had chosen for Sarah's wedding, a place I had paid for, basic. She suggested the Belmont Plaza, a place that would cost nearly twice what we were already spending. That was when I lost it. If you're so concerned about the venue, I said, keeping my voice steady, feel free to pay for the Belmont Plaza yourself. I turned to Sarah and added, since I'm the one covering the entire $150,000 for this wedding, I think the Grand Morrison will do just fine. The silence that followed felt like a heavy curtain falling, thick and suffocating. Linda's face flushed crimson. She stood up so quickly that her chair scraped the floor, and without a word, she grabbed her purse and stormed out. Sarah, her face contorted in rage, followed right behind. How dare you? She screamed, her voice full of venom. How dare you throw the money in Mom's face like that? You're cruel and greedy, and you've ruined everything. She ran upstairs, slamming her bedroom door. I sat there stunned, not believing what had just happened. My entire world felt like it had been turned upside down. Chris didn't offer any support. He didn't say a word about how I had been disrespected. Instead, he just drank his wine and kept to himself. I could feel my anger growing. Later that night, Chris came into the bedroom. He had that look on his face, the one that told me he was going to ask me to apologize. "You need to apologize to Sarah," he said, his voice serious. "What you said to Linda was completely out of line." I stared at him, incredulous. Apologize for what? For standing up for myself? For letting Linda walk all over me in my own house? He suggested that maybe I could have been gentler with Sarah, but I was done. "I'm not apologizing," I said firmly. "Not this time. I've been pushed aside for far too long. I'm done." Chris got up, grabbed his pillow, and left the room. "Fine," he muttered. "I'll sleep in the living room until you come to your senses." I didn't care. I felt a sense of relief I hadn't felt in a long time. It wasn't sadness or regret. It was freedom. For the first time in 12 years, I was no longer the person who had to fix everything, who had to buy their affection. The next morning, I got a call from my mother. "Maddie, honey," she said, "I wanted to ask you about Sarah's wedding. What's the date and venue? Your dad and I haven't received an invitation yet." My stomach churned. I had expected this, but hearing it from my mother, someone who had been there for Sarah for years, made it all the more real. My own mother had not even received an invitation to Sarah's wedding. I had never felt so disrespected. And then Sarah walked in. I confronted her immediately. "I just got off the phone with my mother," I said, my voice calm but heavy with the weight of my anger. "She's asking about the wedding invitations. They never arrived." Sarah didn't look at me. Her eyes stayed fixed on the floor. "I'm not inviting them," she said, her voice bitter. "I'm not inviting strangers to my wedding." The words hit me like a slap. Strangers? My family, the people who had supported her and loved her for over a decade, were now strangers. I couldn't believe it. "That's wrong, Sarah," I said, my voice shaking. "They've loved you, supported you, and now you're calling them strangers?" Sarah laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You want to talk about ugly? After what you did to my mom last night?" Her eyes flashed with anger. "Actually, you know what? I don't want you at my wedding either." The words stopped me in my tracks. The final blow, after everything I had done for her, everything I had sacrificed, she had the nerve to say this to me. I couldn't stay in that room any longer. "Fine," I said, my voice calm but steady. "I won't come to your wedding." Without another word, I walked out of the room, leaving Sarah standing there, her mouth agape, as I moved toward my office. The clarity of the decision felt freeing. For the first time in over a decade, I wasn't going to be manipulated into doing something I didn't want to do. The next steps came quickly. I revoked Sarah's access to the wedding account and canceled everything. The $150,000 wedding was over before it even started. It was time to take control of my life. Weeks passed, and the tension between Sarah and me lingered. She returned to our house after a couple of days at Michael's, acting as though nothing had happened. We resumed talking about wedding details, but I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. The warmth and closeness we once had felt strained, like we were both walking on eggshells. Then one evening, the bombshell came. We were having dinner when Sarah casually dropped a comment that made my stomach twist. "So, Mom found out about the wedding," she said, her voice casual, but there was an edge to it. My fork paused midair as I processed her words. "What do you mean she found out?" I asked, confused. For 12 years, Sarah's biological mother, Linda, had barely been mentioned in our household. I knew she'd had some issues with alcohol, leading to the divorce when Sarah was young. After that, she moved to Arizona and all but disappeared from Sarah's life. No birthday cards, no calls at Christmas, just silence. I never thought much of it because Sarah had never seemed particularly interested in reconnecting with her mother. But now, there she was, suddenly involved in the wedding. "She wants to be part of the wedding planning," Sarah continued, as though this was no big deal. "I invited her over for dinner this weekend." The air in the room seemed to thicken, and I couldn't hide my reaction. My blood ran cold. "You invited her over?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. This was my house, the home I had built from the ground up, the home where I'd given everything to create a family. And now, after all these years of Sarah having nothing to do with her mother, she was inviting her over to discuss the wedding without even asking me. Chris, who had been sitting silently up until now, looked uncomfortable. He avoided making eye contact as I absorbed Sarah's words. "That's fine," I said, my voice now level but with an edge of frustration. "I'll prepare dinner, but I'm not happy about this." I stood up and began walking to the kitchen to start preparing for Linda's visit. Every movement felt mechanical. I didn't want to cook for this woman who had abandoned her daughter, but I knew that, somehow, it was expected of me. The evening went just as I had imagined, uneasy and awkward. I spent hours in the kitchen preparing an elaborate meal, herb-crusted rack of lamb, roasted vegetables, and homemade bread. I wanted everything to be perfect, but I couldn't shake the feeling of resentment as I thought about Linda's history. Linda finally arrived, exactly 30 minutes late. She was tall, blonde, and had the same sharp features as Sarah, but where Sarah was soft and warm, Linda had hard edges. She scanned my house with an air of critical appraisal, as if inspecting my taste and choices. "What a large house," she remarked, emphasizing the word large in a way that made it sound like an insult. Dinner started out uneventfully enough, but it quickly turned into a series of passive-aggressive comments. The first came when she tasted the lamb. "I always made this with rosemary and garlic," she said slowly, cutting another piece with exaggerated slowness. "It really brings out the flavor better. Sarah used to love it when I made it." With every criticism, I kept my mouth shut, waiting for Chris to intervene, but he said nothing. He'd been married to Linda, so he knew exactly what was going on, but he just kept eating. I, on the other hand, gripped my fork tighter, trying to hold back the anger building inside me. As the dinner continued, Linda criticized everything. The vegetables were overcooked. The bread wasn't crispy enough. It felt as though nothing I had done was good enough. Sarah sat there, beaming at her mother as if Linda were the most wonderful person in the world. My frustration only grew. When the conversation turned to the wedding, Linda casually suggested that Sarah change her wedding venue. "You can't have your wedding at the Grand Morrison," Linda said, wrinkling her nose. "It's so basic. The Belmont Plaza is much more prestigious. That's where you should have it." I could feel the anger rising in me. The Belmont Plaza was nearly double the cost of the Grand Morrison, and I had already transferred the money for the wedding. I wasn't going to let Linda come into my house, criticize my choices, and then suggest that I wasn't spending enough on the wedding. "If you're so concerned about the venue," I said, my voice now tight, "feel free to pay for the Belmont Plaza yourself. Since I'm covering the entire $150,000 for this wedding, I think the Grand Morrison will do just fine." The silence that followed was deafening. Linda's face flushed bright red as she stood up so quickly her chair scraped against the floor. "I can see I'm not welcome here," she said, snatching her purse. "Sarah, call me tomorrow, honey." She stormed out, slamming the door behind her. Sarah turned on me, her face twisted in rage. "How dare you?" she screamed. "How dare you throw the money in Mom's face like that? You're cruel and greedy, and you've ruined everything." She ran upstairs and I could hear the door slam shut behind her. I sat there stunned, trying to process what had just happened. Later that night, Chris came into our bedroom with a serious look on his face. "You need to apologize to Sarah," he said, his voice quiet but firm. I looked at him, incredulous. "Apologize for what? For telling the truth? Your ex-wife came into my house, criticized everything I did, and then suggested I was being cheap about a wedding I'm paying for entirely on my own." "I know, but still you didn't have to embarrass her like that," Chris said. "Now Sarah's upset." I shook my head. "I'm not apologizing. Not this time." Chris grabbed his pillow. "Fine. I'll sleep in the living room until you come to your senses." And with that, he left. I didn't follow him. I was done trying to appease people who didn't respect me, even if they were family. It wasn't long before I felt like the dam was finally about to burst. I had tried so hard to remain calm, to rationalize everything. But deep down, I knew that something had shifted, something fundamental. And it wasn't just Sarah, Chris too. He had always been my rock, the man I could lean on. But in the days that followed, I realized he wasn't seeing things as clearly as I was. Sarah's behavior continued to be erratic. She would act like nothing had changed, talking about wedding details one minute and then shutting me out the next. It was as if I had become a secondary character in my own life. The more I tried to stay involved, the more she seemed to resist, distancing herself with every passing day. I had tried to give her space. I had even tried to back off, thinking it might be just pre-wedding jitters, that she would come around. But when she walked into the house one evening, practically glowing, telling us that her mother, Linda, was coming to dinner, Something inside me snapped. Linda was a name I hadn't heard much in the past 12 years, and for good reason. Linda was Sarah's biological mother. She had struggled with a drinking problem when Sarah was young, and after the divorce, she moved to Arizona and essentially disappeared from Sarah's life. There were no birthday cards, no calls on Christmas, and no messages for graduations. She'd abandoned Sarah in the most profound way, and yet, now she was suddenly back in the picture? It made no sense. I was furious, but I kept my composure. "You invited Linda?" I asked, trying to keep the tremor from my voice. "Without even asking me first?" "She's back in town," Sarah explained, her voice laced with excitement. "She wants to be part of the wedding planning. I thought it'd be nice if we all had dinner together." I took a deep breath, trying to remain calm, but the resentment was boiling inside me. "This is my house, Sarah," I said slowly, my voice steady, though my hands clenched around the wine glass. "My home, and if you're going to invite her over, at least you could have asked me first." But instead of the apology I expected, I was met with defensiveness. Sarah's face hardened. "I don't need to ask you for permission," she snapped. "It's my wedding, and my mom deserves to be part of it." I didn't know how to respond to that. It felt like the final straw. I spent hours preparing for dinner, thinking about how everything was going to be perfect. I had cooked a gorgeous meal, herb-crusted lamb, roasted vegetables, homemade bread, and now it was going to be overshadowed by the presence of a woman who had never even cared to acknowledge Sarah until now. When Linda finally arrived, 30 minutes late, she immediately began scrutinizing everything. "What a large house," she said, her voice dripping with disdain. "It's big." I could hear the hidden insult in her tone. Dinner proceeded with the same tone. Linda criticized my cooking, the vegetables, the lamb, everything. With each passing moment, I could feel the tension building. I waited for Chris to step in, to defend me, to at least acknowledge how uncomfortable the situation was. But he didn't. He stayed silent, his eyes fixed on his plate. Linda's criticisms continued, and my frustration grew. But when she suggested that Sarah change her wedding venue from the Grand Morrison to the Belmont Plaza, a place that would cost almost double what we had already planned, something inside me snapped. I couldn't take it anymore. "If you're so concerned about the venue," I said, my voice rising, "then why don't you pay for the Belmont Plaza yourself? I'm the one paying for this entire wedding, Linda, and I think the Grand Morrison will do just fine." The silence that followed was deafening. Linda's face flushed red, and I saw her stand up so quickly that her chair scraped loudly against the floor. "I can see I'm not welcome here," she said, grabbing her purse. "Sarah, call me tomorrow. I'll see you then." Before I could say anything else, she stormed out, slamming the door behind her. I was still trying to process what had just happened when Sarah turned on me. "How dare you?" she screamed. "How dare you embarrass her like that? You ruined everything." I could hardly believe what I was hearing. After all the time I'd spent with Sarah, all the sacrifices I had made for her, this is how she was going to react? "I didn't ruin anything," I said quietly. She came into my house, criticized everything I did, and then suggested I was being cheap. I'm not going to let her walk all over me. Sarah ran upstairs, slamming her bedroom door behind her. I sat there in stunned silence, trying to wrap my head around what had just transpired. I had given everything to her, and now, this is how she saw me? Later that night, Chris came into the bedroom, his face dark with anger. "You need to apologize to Sarah," he said, his voice low. "What you said to Linda was completely out of line." I looked at him, feeling like I was seeing him for the first time. "Apologize for what? Telling the truth?" I asked. "She came into my house, disrespected me, and I stood up for myself. I'm not apologizing for that." Chris's eyes hardened. "Then I'll sleep in the living room until you come to your senses." I was speechless. This was the man I had married, the man I had loved for over a decade, and he was taking Sarah's side. The next morning, things only got worse. Sarah came down for breakfast, and after a tense silence, she dropped the bombshell. She had decided to uninvite my family from the wedding. "They're not coming," she said flatly. The words hit me like a slap in the face. "Excuse me?" I asked, my voice shaking with disbelief. She didn't even flinch. "I'm not inviting them. They're strangers. I don't want them at my wedding." That was it. After everything I had done for her, after all the years of sacrifice, she was now calling my parents strangers? I felt my world crumble in an instant. I'm done, I said, my voice steady now. If you don't want me at your wedding, then fine. I won't be there. I could see the shock on her face, but I didn't care anymore. I had given everything, and now it was time to stop. I walked upstairs, and without hesitation, I revoked Sarah's access to the wedding account. The money that had been set aside for her wedding was now gone. That was the moment I knew there was no going back. The silence in the house felt different the next day. It was as if the air had been sucked out, and I was left standing in the middle of a storm. Chris hadn't spoken to me since our argument, and Sarah was in her room, probably crying. But I didn't care. I had reached my limit. The following morning, as I sipped my coffee alone, I thought back on everything I had done for them. The years of support, the sacrifices, the money, the love. I had given everything. And yet, here I was, standing alone. The phone call from my mother had only deepened my anger. She had called me earlier, asking about the wedding. What's the date and venue? Your dad and I haven't received an invitation yet, and neither has Jenny. I wasn't surprised. It was typical of Sarah's behavior. She hadn't been able to give a damn about anyone else, especially me. The more I thought about it, the more my decision solidified. When Sarah walked through the door a few hours later, I didn't even look up. My anger was simmering, but it was calm, controlled, like the stillness before a storm. Sarah, we need to talk, I said, keeping my voice steady, even though I felt like everything inside me was screaming. She walked into the kitchen, her body language defensive, as usual. What now? She asked, her tone cold. I just got a call from my mother, I said, watching her carefully. She asked about the wedding invitations, the ones you apparently forgot to send. Sarah's eyes shifted. She looked almost guilty, but instead of owning up to anything, she lifted her chin defiantly. I'm not inviting them, she said sharply, her voice cutting through the tension. They're strangers to me. Strangers? I repeated in disbelief. My parents are strangers to you? The people who've supported you for over a decade? Who's been there for every birthday and every milestone? I don't want them there, Sarah snapped, her face red with anger. And I don't want you there either. The words felt like a slap to my face. I could feel my heart sink, but I didn't let it show. Instead, I kept my composure, my voice calm. Let me get this straight, I said, standing up and walking slowly toward her. You don't want me, your stepmother, the person paying for your entire wedding, to come? That's right, she said, her voice growing colder. I don't want you at my wedding. I felt an odd calmness wash over me. I had been standing in the shadows for too long, trying to please everyone, but no more. Fine, I said, my voice eerily calm. I won't come. The silence that followed was deafening. I could feel my heart pounding, but my exterior was composed. Since you don't want me there, I'm revoking your access to the wedding account. I won't pay for a wedding I'm not even invited to, I continued. Her face froze, and the tears that had been welling up in her eyes started to spill over. She opened her mouth to protest, but no words came out. I'll take care of it, I said, walking past her. I've made my decision. I walked upstairs and took a deep breath before logging into the wedding account. A few clicks, and just like that, Sarah no longer had access to the money I had set aside for her wedding. The money was gone, the arrangements canceled, and the life I had spent so many years building had been shattered. That evening, when I told Chris about the changes, he didn't take it well. He demanded that I apologize, that I fix everything, but I knew it was too late for apologies. I had already done too much for too long, and Sarah's behavior had crossed a line that couldn't be uncrossed. By the next day, the house was eerily quiet. No Sarah, no Chris. They had left, taking their things with them. The finality of it all hit me like a wave, but instead of feeling regret, I felt relief. For the first time in years, I was free. Free from the expectations, free from manipulation, free from the sacrifices that had gone unappreciated. The house felt different without them, lighter, somehow, and for the first time, I could breathe again. The silence in the house after Sarah and Chris left was deafening. I stood in the foyer, the door closing softly behind them, feeling an unexpected sense of relief wash over me. The weight of years of sacrifice, manipulation, and expectations had been lifted. I no longer had to fight for respect. It had all become so clear to me. I had done enough. The next few days were filled with quiet, which I had never experienced in this house before. No bickering, no passive-aggressive comments, and no pressure to make everyone happy. Just peace. I began reclaiming my space, rearranging furniture, organizing rooms that had been overtaken by Sarah's things. It felt therapeutic, as though I were healing from an old wound I didn't even know was there. The calls and messages came in waves. Michael's mother reached out first, her message dripping with judgment. "I hope you realize what you've done. This wedding might fail because of your actions. How can you be so heartless?" I took a breath, steadying myself before replying. "I'm not heartless. I'm just done being disrespected." I blocked her immediately. It felt good to let go of the constant pressure to apologize for doing what was right for me. As the divorce papers were finalized, I couldn't help but wonder if Chris had ever understood the full weight of what he had done. The prenup I'd insisted on had made everything straightforward. The business, the house, the money, everything I'd built was protected. It wasn't just about the wedding anymore. It was about reclaiming myself, my dignity, and my future. 2 months later, I had moved on. I didn't care to know how Sarah's wedding turned out. I had blocked them all. My life was mine now. And when I sat in my garden, coffee in hand, watching the sun rise over my flowers, I didn't feel the sting of betrayal. I felt something I hadn't known in years: freedom.